This is MTG Burgeoning, and in this video we are going to showcase the quintessential cards needed to build the core of a Fairy Tribal Commander deck with Alela Cunning Conqueror as the general. Alela Cunning Conqueror made her debut as the secondary commander option in the Fey Dominion pre-constructed EDH deck from Wilds of Eldraine. This iteration of Alela is a 2/4 Fairy Warlock with flying for 2 in Dimir colors. That's 1 blue and 1 black mana. Whenever we cast our first spell during each opponent's turn, we create a 1/1 black Fairy Rogue creature token with flying. Whenever one or more fairies we control deal combat damage to a player, we goad target creature that player controls. When we goad a creature, that creature must attack someone other than us each turn if able. Our game plan here is pretty straightforward. We want to cast spells during our opponent's turns. In so doing, we bolster our side of the battlefield by creating evasive Fairy Rogue creature tokens, and we send our fairies into combat and goad our opponent's most threatening creatures. By keeping our opponent's most threatening creatures engaged with each other, we are offered greater opportunities for board development and battlefield management. This dynamic will eventually overwhelm our opponents as we claim victory after victory after victory. We begin the core of this EDH build by showcasing a slew of fairy creature spells with the Flash mechanic. Spells with Flash allow us to cast them at any time we could cast an instant, which means we can cast them during our opponent's turns and trigger Alela's token-producing ability. Sweetening this dynamic for us is that these fairy creature spells also have flying. This evasiveness will help to trigger Alela's goad ability once we send them into combat. Let's start with Scion of Una, who gives other fairies we control +1/+1 in Shroud, which means that they cannot be the target of spells or any abilities. Note that this prevents us from targeting them with our own spells and abilities as well. Let's continue with some peripheral card advantage effects. When Fairy Harbinger comes into play, we may search our library for a fairy card, reveal it, shuffle, and then put that card on top of our library. Whenever an opponent draws their second card each turn, Fairy Mastermind has us draw a card. It also has an activated ability that has each player draw a card for 3 and 1 blue mana. If we activate this ability during an opponent's turn, then we end up drawing 2 cards due to Fairy Mastermind's triggered ability. Note that we do not have to tap this creature in order to activate its card-drawing ability, which, for the purposes of optimization, means that we can activate it multiple times during a round of turns. Nimrus, Una's Trickster, provides another benefit to casting spells during our opponent's turns. Whenever we cast our first spell during each opponent's turn, we look at the top 2 cards of our library. We put one of them into our hand and the other into our graveyard. Cards in hand equals problems for opponents, even more so when Alela is on our side of the battlefield. Alela's goad ability is not the only way we can interact with our opponents or their sides of the battlefield. When Spellstutter Sprite enters the battlefield, we counter target spell with mana value X or less, where X is equal to the number of fairies we control. We should have little trouble countering an opponent's spell with this fairy. When Dandelion Click comes into play, we look at target player's hand. We may choose a non-land card from it. If we do, then that player reveals the chosen card, puts it on the bottom of their library, and then draws a card. Note that we could target ourselves with Dandelion Click's Enter the Battlefield trigger. Through its Champion a Fairy mechanic, whenever Mistbind Click enters the battlefield, we sacrifice it unless we exile another fairy we control. When Mistbind Click leaves the battlefield, we return the exile card to the battlefield. When a fairy is championed this way, we tap all lands target player controls. With other yet-to-be-revealed ways to bounce our fairies from the battlefield, Mistbind Click can cause a lot of headaches for our opponents. Brazen Bowerer can only block creatures with flying, but no worries, its presence in this build is for attacking, not blocking. Well, combat effectiveness aside, the adventure portion of this card is valuable as well. At instant speed, Petty Theft returns target non-land permanent an opponent controls back to its owner's hand. Whenever another fairy enters the battlefield under our control, Obira, Dreaming Duelist, has each opponent lose 1 life. Through Alela's token-producing ability, we can consider Obira a win condition in this build. Continuing with our desire to interact more with our opponents, when Stingblade Assassin enters the battlefield, we destroy target creature an opponent controls that was dealt damage this turn. With Stingblade Assassin, our opponent should be wary of chump blocking any of our creatures. When Pestermite enters the battlefield, we may tap or untap target permanent. Note that this target permanent does not have to be an opponent's, we could choose one of our own. For some battlefield and combat shenanigans, when Quickling comes into play, we sacrifice it unless we return another creature we control to its owner's hand. We may pay a blue and a black mana and pay 1 life to return a Widewind the Biting Gale to our hand as well. These fairies can create a lot of combat headaches for our opponents. The same could be said for Malleable Imposter, which enters the battlefield as a copy of a creature an opponent controls, except it's a fairy shapeshifter with flying in addition to its other types. Note that any enter the battlefield abilities of the copied permanent will trigger when Malleable Imposter enters the battlefield. The Vorthos in us may not be happy, but we have some non-fairy cards with flash that fit into our theme very, very well. Cunning Nightbonder reduces the cost of spells we cast with flash by 1 generic mana, and they cannot be countered. In a way, so does Naiad of Hidden Coves. As long as it is not our turn, spells we cast cost 1 generic mana less to cast. In a build thematically crafted to cast spells during our opponent's turns, Cunning Nightbonder and Naiad of Hidden Coves optimize our ability to do so. For card advantage benefits, whenever we cast a spell that has flash, Slitherwisp draws us a card and each opponent loses 1 life. Adding a peripheral global life loss effect for our opponents that is tied to our overall theme helps us to win the game even quicker. Opposition Agent has us control our opponents while they're searching their libraries. While an opponent is searching their library, they exile each card they find. We may play those cards for as long as they remain exiled, and we may spend mana as though it were mana of any type to cast them. Flashing Opposition Agent into play when an opponent casts a tutor spell could give us the most powerful card in their library. Speaking of cards, if an opponent would draw a card except the first one they draw in each of their draw steps, that player skips that draw and we draw a card instead. All thanks to Notion Thief. This human rogue has great synergy with the aforementioned Fairy Mastermind. With 3 opponents at the table, we can activate the Mastermind's ability and draw 4 cards for just 4 mana. For board state development, whenever a creature entering the battlefield under an opponent's control causes a triggered ability of that creature to trigger, Aboleth's Spawn allows us the option of copying that ability, and we may choose new targets for the copy. If our opponents are sporting decks sculpted to take advantage of enter the battlefield triggers, then Aboleth's Spawn is going to do a lot of work for us during the game. When Orcish Bowmasters enters the battlefield, and whenever an opponent draws a card, except for the first card they draw on each of their draw steps, Orcish Bowmasters deals 1 damage to any target, and then we amass Orcs 1, which means that we put a +1/+1 counter on an army we control. It's also an orc. If we don't control an army, then we create a 0/0 black orc army creature token first. Here we can spread around direct damage and incrementally boost the power and toughness of a potential beat-down creature token. For battlefield management, Hullbreaker Horror can completely take over the game. It cannot be countered, and whenever we cast a spell, we choose up to one of the following 2 modes. Either we return target spell we don't control to its owner's hand, or we return target non-land permanent we don't control to its owner's hand. Either way, we are limiting our opponent's ability to add to or maintain their board states. In a build crafted to cast numerous spells during a round of turns, Hullbreaker Horror can be considered a win condition here. Mocking Doppelganger enters the battlefield as a copy of a creature an opponent controls, except it has other creatures with the same name as this creature are goaded. Turning our opponent's creatures against each other is one of Alela's abilities, so adding a little redundancy helps our game plan. Continuing with this idea is Misleading Signpost. When it enters the battlefield during the Declare Attacker's step, we may reselect which player or permanent target creature is attacking. Although this combat trick ability triggers only once, we can tap this artifact to add a blue mana to our mana pool. Since the prevalence of Flash is so vital to this Alela build, let's include some additional payoffs for whenever we cast our first spell during each opponent's turn. For card advantage benefits, Blightwing Bandit has us look at the top card of that player's library and then exile it face down. We may play that card for as long as it remains exiled, and we may spend mana as though it were mana of any type to cast it. Although it's not a fairy, Wave Break Hippocamp draws us a card. Whenever we cast any spell during an opponent's turn, and not just the first spell during their turn, Glenalendra Pranksters offers us the option of returning target creature we control to its owner's hand, while Dream Spoilers gives up to one target creature an opponent controls -1/-1 until end of turn. The Prankster's Bounce ability can return our creatures with Flash to our hand, which allows us to cast them again during our opponent's turns, while Dream Spoilers' -1/-1 ability helps to rid the battlefield of our opponent's problematic creatures. Pairing these fairies with our Flash dynamic can help us manage the battlefield and control the game even more effectively. Although there are a few non-fairy creature cards splashed into the core of this build, let's not forget that this is a fairy tribal deck at heart. With that in mind, we want to include some cards that synergize with our beloved tribe. We begin with some more card advantage effects. Tegwill, Duke of Splendor, gives other fairies we control +1/+1, and whenever a fairy we control dies, we draw a card and lose 1 life. Whenever we attack with one or more fairies, and we will be attacking with a lot of fairies in this build, Talion's Messenger has us draw a card and then discard a card. When we discard a card this way, we put a +1/+1 counter on the target fairy we control. The Messenger's looting effect and +1/+1 counter delivery system keep cards flowing into our hand while making our fairies more and more threatening. For a more limited card advantage effect, the adventure side of Picklock Prankster, Free the Fae, has us mill 4 cards at instant speed. We then put an instant sorcery or fairy card from among the mill cards into our hand. For battlefield enhancement, Glenalendra Liege gives other blue creatures we control +1/+1 and gives other black creatures we control +1/+1 as well. Note that if any of our creatures are both blue and black, then they will get +2/+2. Glenalendra Liege's Anthem effects powerfully synergize with Una, Queen of the Fae. For X generic mana and a Dimir hybrid mana, we choose a color. Target opponent exiles the top X cards of their library. For each card of the chosen color exiled this way, we create a 1/1 blue and black fairy rogue creature token with flying. When paired with Glenalendra Liege, these tokens are 3/3s. Alela approves. Speaking of creature tokens, at the beginning of our upkeep, Bitter Blossom has us lose 1 life and we create a 1/1 black fairy rogue creature token with flying. An early turn Bitter Blossom in a game of EDH tips the battlefield completely in our favor. Whenever we cast a fairy or wizard spell, Archmage of Echoes copies it, and the copy becomes a token. Archmage of Echoes has an identical mana value and almost identical effect as Reflections of Litjara. When this enchantment comes into play, we choose fairies, of course, and whenever we cast a fairy spell, we copy it, which, again, the copy becomes a token. For more opponent interaction, Spell Stutter counters target spell unless its controller pays 2 generic mana plus 1 generic mana for each fairy we control. In this build, we should be able to counter any spell that an opponent casts with Spell Stutter. Whenever one or more fairies we control deal combat damage to a player, Nettling Nuisance has that player create a 4/2 red pirate creature token with This Creature Cannot Block. This creature token is goaded for the rest of the game, which is even more Alela redundancy. Whenever one or more fairies we control deal combat damage to a player, we put a +1/+1 counter on Fairy Bladecrafter. When Fairy Bladecrafter dies, each opponent loses X life and we gain X life, where X is equal to its power. Note that if one or more fairies we control deal combat damage to a number of different opponents in one turn, then we put a +1/+1 counter onto Fairy Bladecrafter for each of the opponents dealt combat damage by our creatures during that turn. A steady stream of card-drawing spells and abilities helps to keep the pressure on our opponents, particularly since we want to cast as many spells during their turns as possible for the purposes of triggering our aforementioned abilities, including Alela's, as frequently as possible. Opt and Consider check these boxes. Both cost 1 blue mana and respectively scry 1 and surveil 1 before they have us draw a card. Frantic Search has us draw 2 cards, discard 2 cards, and then untap up to 3 lands. Let's not overlook the value of this card, as the lands we tapped to cast it during an opponent's turn can be tapped in order to cast another spell during our next opponent's turn. Fact or Fiction has us reveal the top 5 cards of our library. An opponent separates those cards into 2 piles. We put one of them into our hand and the other into our graveyard. Note that each of these spells are instants, which, of course, can be cast during our opponent's turns. For bigger burst card draw effects, Distant Melody draws us a card for each permanent we control of the chosen type, which, of course, will be fairies. Pact of the Serpent follows suit and has target player draw X cards and lose X life, where X is equal to the number of creatures they control of the chosen type. For repeatable card draw effects, Vanquisher's Banner draws us a card whenever we cast a fairy creature spell, as long as we choose fairies when this artifact enters the battlefield. It also gives creatures we control of the chosen type +1/+1. Whenever a blue creature enters the battlefield under our control, Dire Undercurrents provides us the option of having target player draw a card. Whenever a black creature enters the battlefield under our control, we also have the option of having target player discard a card. This enchantment can create a chasm-like disparity in card resources between us and our opponents. Whenever a creature we control deals combat damage to a player, both Bident of Thassa and Reconnaissance Mission provide us the option of drawing a card. We also can pay 1 on a blue mana and tap the Bident to have creatures our opponents control attack this turn if able, and we can pay 2 generic mana and cycle Reconnaissance Mission from our hand in order to draw a card. Kindred Discovery has the potential to draw us a lot of cards, especially in a build like this one. By choosing fairies when this enchantment comes into play, we draw a card whenever a fairy enters the battlefield under our control or attacks. Note that this ability is triggered by any fairy we control, and not just non-token fairies. This means that Alela's token-producing ability, as well as the various aforementioned token-producing abilities showcased earlier in this video, will trigger Kindred Discovery and put oodles and oodles of cards into our hand. Due to the numerous instances of card-drawing abilities inundating the core of this build, it would serve us well to include Reliquary Tower, Thought Vessel, Library of Lang, and Wizard class. These cards give us no maximum hand size, which is vitally important for the purposes of keeping cards in excess of 7 in our hand and not being forced to discard those cards at the end of our turn. Reliquary Tower and Thought Vessel also tap to add a colorless mana to our mana pool. If an effect causes us to discard a card, Library of Lang has us discard the card, but we may put it on top of our library instead of into our graveyard. Level 2 of Wizard class draws us 2 cards, and Level 3 allows us to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature we control whenever we draw a card. With these levels all very relevant to our theme, Wizard class may be the most powerful card in the core of this build. And lastly, of course, no Flash-centric build is complete without Leyline of Anticipation or Vidalcan Orrery. These cards allow us to cast our spells as though they had Flash. Note that if Leyline of Anticipation is in our opening hand, then we may begin the game with it on the battlefield. Hopefully, after showcasing this build, we will be able to begin additional games of Magic with our opponents in the future. This video provided a blueprint for building the core of a Fairy Tribal Commander deck with Alela Cunning Conqueror as the general. The cards showcased during this video are suggested options for crafting the thematic core of a Fairy Tribal EDH deck, in addition to providing ways of optimizing this theme. Removal spells, disruption, ramp, and the land base can vary from build to build, and also are dependent on metagame preferences and availability. In building around videos like this one, these deck components are left in the hands of each individual deck brewer. If you found this video appealing, then be sure to check out our other building around videos through the playlist on your screen. Also be sure to check out our other deck building series, and don't forget to let me know your thoughts about the core of this Alela build in the comments section below. This is MTG Burgeoning, your your channel for all things Magic.